The fog lay heavy over Paris, the kind of fog that seemed to rise from the Seine itself, curling around the bridges and swallowing the lamps one by one, until only faint circles of yellow light trembled in the mist. Somewhere behind those curtains of vapour, footsteps moved with a purpose, echoing against the wet stones of the quay. It was a silence that was never truly silent, broken by the distant whistle of a tug, the coughing of a late carriage horse, the quiet clatter of shutters being drawn against the night. In this thickness of air, a man without a past had slipped into the city, and somewhere in the labyrinth of alleys and taverns, a life had already been extinguished. For Maigret, called from his chair at the Quai des Orfèvres, it was not only another investigation but a duel, though the adversary this time was not a man with a name or history, but a shadow who seemed to leave no trace behind. The duel would not be fought with pistols or words, but with patience, intuition, and the stubborn gaze of a detective who knew that even the fog carried secrets if one stood still long enough to listen. If these drifting scenes draw you into the murk of Maigret's world, stay close to this story. And while you're here, help us keep the light burning in these foggy Paris nights. Share this journey with others, subscribe so you will not lose the thread, and let the echoes of the case carry further into the dark. Now the shape of this story must be traced like chalk upon damp stones, each chapter a step deeper into the shadows of a city and a crime. The summons reached him just as he had settled into his armchair, pipe freshly packed, the faint perfume of Madame Maigret's stew drifting from the kitchen. It was winter, though not the kind with snow that softened the city into silence, but the kind with fog, a clammy blanket that rose from the Seine and clung to every corner of Paris. At the Quai des Orfèvres there was never truly rest, yet even Maigret had hoped that this evening would pass without interruption. When the telephone rang, sharp and metallic in the stillness, he rose with a sigh, as though the sound itself already carried the chill of the river. By the time he stepped into the night, the fog had thickened to the point that even the glow of the street lamps seemed muffled, halos of yellow dimmed and swallowed in milky air. He turned the collar of his heavy overcoat up around his neck and felt the moisture bead against the fabric. The police car waiting by the curb was little more than a darker shadow among shadows, its headlights reduced to pale discs struggling against the mist. Inside, Lucas gave a brief nod, his face grave, and neither man felt the need to speak as the car set off. The city outside was a ghostly blur, bridges, barges, solitary pedestrians moving like figures half erased from a charcoal sketch. They stopped near the Pont Neuf, where the Seine curved broad and dark, its surface broken only by the sluggish movement of water and the sudden, startling cry of a tug's whistle. The fog here was so dense that the quay seemed suspended between water and sky, the stones glistening as if from a perpetual rain. A cluster of uniformed men stood huddled near the embankment, their breaths visible, their movements cautious. At their feet lay the body, hauled from the river only moments before, a crumpled form still dripping, the hair plastered to a pale forehead. Maigret crouched, the cold biting through the knees of his trousers. The man was neither young nor old, perhaps in his 30s or early 40s, dressed simply in a dark suit that had lost all shape from the soaking. No wallet, no papers, no watch, only the bare clothes of an anonymous city dweller. The face, slack in death, carried no scars or marks to speak of, no features that leapt out as belonging to any known type. It was a face you might pass on a boulevard and forget a moment later, the kind of face that resisted memory. "Nothing on him?" Maigret asked, his voice low, roughened by the cold air and the pipe he had set aside too soon. "Not a thing," Lucas replied. Pockets empty, shoes ordinary. The men say no one saw him fall. He was floating near the bridge when they spotted him. The inspector's gaze lingered on the hands, broad, capable, calloused in places, but not the hands of a labourer. He noticed a faint bruise on the right temple, perhaps from a blow, perhaps from striking the stones when he went in. The water distorted so much, it left one guessing more than it told. He rose slowly, his greatcoat heavy, and let his eyes drift across the river. The fog blurred everything, the arches of the bridge, the distant outlines of houses, the lamps glowing like faint stars. Somewhere in that murk, the man had lived his final moments, whether by accident, violence, or his own will. And now it fell to Maigret to pull meaning from silence. A fisherman, wrapped in scarves and smelling of damp wool, shuffled forward with a muttered account of how he had glimpsed a figure on the quay before the splash. His words, uncertain and full of hesitation, offered no clarity. Too much fog, too much distance, too much imagination. Maigret listened patiently, nodding, filing it away without judgment. Testimony in fog was as unreliable as shadows at dusk. They loaded the body into the waiting van, the wheels crunching against the cobblestones as it moved off toward the morgue. Maigret remained by the river a little longer, his pipe lit now, the smoke curling upward and vanishing into the mist as though swallowed by the same invisible hand that had claimed the dead man. He had seen countless bodies pulled from the Seine, lovers, suicides, drunks, and those with knife wounds hidden beneath their shirts. But there was something here that resisted classification, and he felt it in the silence that stretched too far, in the way the man's features refused to tell even the smallest story. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the building loomed through the fog like a fortress of stone, its windows glowing faintly, promising warmth and the endless murmur of typewriters and telephones. Inside, the corridors smelled of ink and damp coats, the kind of lived-in odour that never fully left. Maigret removed his overcoat, his shoulders damp, and shook the moisture from his hat before heading to his office. A lamp burned on his desk, casting shadows across the papers already piled there, though his eyes drifted past them to the faint silhouettes beyond the window, the city blurred, the river hidden. The initial report arrived, no identifying marks, no personal effects, estimated time in the water, no more than a few hours. The body had been well fed, reasonably clothed, not destitute. Death was likely not by drowning, though the lungs held some water. The bruise on the temple suggested a struggle, but inconclusive. It was, in short, a man without a past, delivered into their hands by the river. Maigret filled his pipe again, tamping the tobacco with the care of a ritual. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the faint hum of the building. Every case began with fragments, but usually there was at least one thread, a letter, a witness with conviction, a scrap of paper, a rumour shouted in a café. Here there was nothing but absence, and absence, Maigret knew, could be as deliberate as any presence. A man could erase himself piece by piece until nothing remained, not even memory, and still walk unnoticed among the crowds of Paris. Until at last he ended in the river. He thought of Madame Maigret waiting at home, the stew cooling on the stove, the simple life he always returned to after the darkness of the streets. The contrast struck him tonight more than usual, as though the fog had followed him indoors, softening outlines, obscuring certainty. A duel, he thought, though he could not yet name the adversary. The duel had begun the moment that faceless body was lifted from the water. When dawn broke, weak and grey, the fog had not lifted. Paris moved sluggishly, carts rattling along the boulevards, market women calling out through muffled air, barges inching against the current with their whistles low and mournful. Maigret stood once more at the riverbank, coat buttoned to the chin, his breath mingling with the mist. Somewhere in this immensity of city and silence, a killer without a past had moved unseen. It was not the first time Maigret felt the presence of such an adversary, but seldom had it felt so absolute, so deliberate. He lit his pipe again, watching the ember glow faintly through the fog, and resolved that the city itself would yield its secret, even if it took weeks, even if it took patience enough to outlast the silence of stone and water. The Seine whispered below, indifferent as always, carrying its burdens toward the sea. And so it began. The cafes along the quay never slept. Even in the dead hours before dawn, when most of Paris lay shrouded in the same fog that clung stubbornly to the river, there remained pockets of warmth where kerosene lamps glowed, and voices murmured over cheap wine. It was to these places that Maigret turned, as naturally as he might draw on his pipe. He knew that the Seine, with all her secrets, rarely acted alone. Behind every body pulled from her depths, there lingered the smoke of a cafe, the glance of a woman at a back table, the whisper of a dock-worker leaning across his glass. Maigret entered the first cafe by pushing against a warped wooden door that resisted as if reluctant to admit the fog. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke, though not the pleasant aroma of good tobacco, but the stale cloud of cigarettes burned too quickly and forgotten in half-empty ashtrays. A stove crackled near the corner, giving off more noise than heat. Men in caps hunched over cards, their eyes narrow with suspicion, while a barmaid wiped the counter with a rag already soaked from too many uses. Maigret ordered a glass of white, though he barely touched it, preferring instead to let the rim grow damp in his hand as his eyes moved slowly from table to table. He asked no questions at first. He simply watched, letting the room settle around him, waiting until the murmurs quieted and the regulars began to forget the silhouette of the inspector in his heavy coat. Patience was his method, and patience had never failed him. It was only when the moment ripened, when the smoke thinned and someone dared a second glance, that he leaned a little toward the barmaid and murmured the simplest of inquiries. A man, dark-haired, 30, perhaps 40. Quiet, but always sitting alone. Did such a figure pass through? The woman's brow creased as she tried to summon faces from the fog of memory. She gestured vaguely toward the tables near the back, where shadows pooled and conversation was least distinct. Yes, perhaps, she thought aloud, there had been such a man. He came irregularly, never spoke much, never asked for more than a single glass, and always left before the crowd thickened. She could not say more. To her, he was a blur, a figure whose absence was no different from his presence. Maigret left a coin on the counter, his fingers brushing the wood that had absorbed years of spilt wine and whispered confessions. Outside, the fog pressed in again, swallowing him before he had taken 5 steps. He moved slowly along the quay, pipe clenched between his teeth, the faint glow illuminating only a few inches of his path. The cafes were strung along the river like beads, each one holding its cluster of shadows. He would enter them all. In the second cafe, larger and more boisterous, the smell of fried onions mixed with damp wool, creating a fug that clung to the walls. Here, dock workers laughed too loudly, their hands blackened from the barges, their voices carrying over the scrape of chairs. When Maigret showed his face, the laughter dimmed. They knew him, or at least knew his type. The heavy man with the steady eyes who asked questions that led to trouble. Yet when he raised his glass, some nodded, uneasy but respectful. A young man, hair plastered by mist, swore he had seen the drowned one. He leaned close, eager to please, his breath sour with wine. The man had come twice, maybe 3 times, always choosing a seat by the stove, though he never removed his coat. He never joined the games, never touched food, never lingered long. No one knew his name, and no one had tried to learn it. In a place where men vanished with the tide, anonymity was as common as smoke. Maigret listened without interrupting, absorbing every detail, no matter how meagre. He felt the shape of the mystery expand, not with clarity but with weight, pressing upon him like the fog itself. A man had walked these rooms, sat at these tables, and yet left nothing behind, not even a memory strong enough to anchor him. The inspector continued on foot, stopping at one cafe after another until his coat was damp through and his pipe refused to stay lit. Each place offered a variation on the same story. A man, alone, silent, drinking little, disappearing into the mist before conversation could touch him. He was present, yet absent, as though his sole purpose was to erase himself even as he lived. Near dawn, in a narrow street climbing toward Montmartre, Maigret found himself in a darker establishment, a cellar bar, where the lamps smoked and the floor was sticky with old spills. Here the clientele were not dock workers, but the flotsam of Paris, men with no steady trade, women with paint on their faces and weariness in their eyes, shadows that clung to corners and laughed too easily. Maigret's entrance caused a stir, though not one of surprise. Some slipped out the back without finishing their drinks, others shrank into silence. A woman in a frayed shawl, her cheeks rouged unevenly, leaned toward him as he stood by the counter. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. She remembered the man. Yes, he had come, more than once. He sat with his back to the wall, watching the door. Always alone, but never idle. She had thought he was waiting for someone, though no one ever joined him. She could not say more. She had never heard him speak. But she shivered slightly as she recalled his eyes, calm, almost too calm, as if they belonged not to a man but to a shadow. Maigret thanked her and ordered another glass, though he poured most of it onto the floorboards when no one was watching. He stood a while longer, pipe cold between his teeth, staring at the smoke that curled upward and disappeared among the beams. He felt the presence of the drowned man more strongly here than anywhere else, as if his ghost still lingered in the damp wood and stale air. When at last he stepped outside, the fog had begun to thin. The first hints of morning light pressed against the mist, softening its edges but not dispersing it. Paris stirred, carts clattered on cobblestones, shutters creaked open, and the scent of baking bread drifted faintly from unseen ovens. Yet for Maigret the city remained as closed as the man himself. He had walked the cafes, touched the walls, listened to the whispers, and found only the echo of absence. Back at his office, his coat steaming gently near the stove, Maigret wrote in his notebook. The entries were sparse, fragments no larger than size, seen near the stove, drank little, silent, always alone, eyes calm. He stared at the words until they blurred, then underlined them with a heavy stroke of his pen. It was not evidence, not yet, but it was the beginning of a portrait. A man without a past, yes, but also a man who moved through shadows, who cultivated silence, who left cafes before his presence could root in memory. Maigret tamped his pipe and leaned back, gazing at the ceiling where smoke from the stove curled lazily. The duel had shifted from the river to the cafes, but it remained a duel nonetheless against an adversary who refused to be named, and Maigret, with his patience, his silence, his pipe, would wait until the fog lifted. The breakthrough, when it came, was as fragile as a thread, the kind that could snap at the faintest tug. A concierge, bent with age and suspicion, shuffled into the Quai des Orfèvres one grey morning and asked to speak with the inspector himself. Her voice was rasped by years of pipe smoke, her hands red and chapped from endless scrubbing. She carried the faint smell of boiled cabbage and damp cellars, the perfume of the poor Parisian lodging houses. What she told them was simple. A tenant had rented a small room under her care, paid in cash, and had not returned since the evening before. Something in her manner suggested she suspected worse than delinquent rent. Maigret followed her through the labyrinth of streets, the fog still lingering, though now diluted by daylight into a thin veil. The building stood on a narrow street near the Gare de Lyon, its façade grey and pocked with soot, shutters half broken, door worn from decades of hands and boots. Inside, the corridor smelled of damp plaster and coal dust, the air so heavy it clung to his lungs. The concierge led him up the creaking staircase, her keys jangling like muted bells, and paused before a narrow door at the end of the hall. When the lock turned, the door swung inward reluctantly, as if even the hinges resented intrusion. Maigret entered slowly, pipe clenched between his teeth, eyes scanning with the patience of a man accustomed to empty rooms that nonetheless spoke volumes. The space was small, scarcely large enough for a bed, a chair, and a washstand. The wallpaper peeled in curling strips, revealing plaster scarred by damp. The single window looked onto a brick wall, the light dim and lifeless. At first glance, the room was bare. The bed, unmade, showed only the imprint of a man who had slept without comfort, blankets tangled, pillow damp with sweat. The chair by the table was pushed back as if abandoned in haste, yet no object of identity remained. No suitcase, no books, no papers, no clothing beyond what he had worn when he left. Even the drawers of the small chest were empty, their bottoms stained by years of dust. Maigret opened them one by one, his large fingers moving with surprising delicacy. Nothing. Not a scrap of paper, not a stub of pencil, not a coin dropped by accident. He bent closer to the washstand, where the cracked porcelain basin held the faint brown stain of water left to evaporate. The mirror above it, cheap and spotted, bore the smudge of a hand as though the tenant had steadied himself, leaning forward to study his reflection before departing. Maigret stared at that smear, strangely intimate, as if it were the only proof that the man had truly existed here at all. The concierge, hovering in the doorway, protested that she knew little. The man had arrived weeks ago, perhaps a month, with no luggage except a small parcel. He had paid in cash 3 weeks in advance and asked few questions. He left each morning at irregular hours, returned late, and never received visitors. She had heard no voices from within, no music, no laughter, no arguments, only the creak of the floorboards when he moved about. He was, she said, the kind of tenant who both pleased and disturbed a concierge, easy to manage, yet too quiet, too invisible. Maigret nodded, scribbled a few lines in his notebook, and stepped back to survey the room as a whole. The emptiness was deliberate, he felt. People, even the most modest, left traces, a newspaper folded beneath the bed, a shirt collar frayed with wear, a receipt forgotten in a pocket. But this man had scoured his existence clean. He had slept here, yes, but as a passer-by sleeps in a waiting room, careful to leave no mark that might betray the journey. He lit his pipe and sat in the chair, the wood groaning beneath his weight. He let the silence envelop him, the faint drip of water from some hidden pipe echoing through the walls. He imagined the man seated here, elbows on the table, eyes fixed on the lifeless window. Did he smoke? Did he write letters only to burn them after? Or did he simply sit, waiting for night to arrive so he might vanish again into the cafes and quays? Maigret felt the presence of solitude, thick as the damp air. Lucas, standing near the door, shifted uneasily. "It's as if he never lived here," he muttered. "On the contrary," Maigret replied, smoke curling from his lips. "He lived here precisely as he intended, without a trace." The inspector rose and searched more carefully. He examined the floorboards, the cracks along the window, the back of the cupboard door. At last he found something, so small it might have been overlooked forever. A burnt match wedged between the floor and the wall. He picked it up, turned it in his fingers. Ordinary, and yet it proved a man had stood here, struck fire, lit something. A cigarette, perhaps, or a lamp. The match itself revealed nothing, but Maigret slipped it into his pocket as though it were a treasure. The police photographer arrived, his cumbersome equipment steaming in the damp air. He captured the room from every angle, though Maigret suspected the photographs would tell even less than his eyes. Absence did not translate well onto plates. Still, procedure demanded it. Janvier was dispatched to question the neighbours, though Maigret doubted they would recall more than vague impressions. A man climbing the stairs, closing his door softly, footsteps at odd hours. When they left, the concierge locked the door again, though the gesture felt pointless. A locked room without possessions guarded nothing. Maigret paused on the stairs, pipe in hand, and studied the building itself. The smell of damp bread drifted from some unseen kitchen. The murmur of quarrels echoed faintly through the walls. Life pulsed here, stubborn and ordinary, yet within that one small room a man had chosen to erase himself. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the reports began to pile up. No luggage had been stored in the station cloakrooms under his description. No tailor recalled fitting a suit like the one he wore. No tobacconist claimed him as a regular customer. It was as though he had walked through Paris without touching ground, like a shadow gliding across fog. Maigret sat in his office long after dusk, the lamp casting its circle of yellow light across the desk. He stared at the empty glass on the corner, the cold pipe resting in his hand, and thought again of the smudge on the mirror, the burnt match, the bare mattress. They were the only words spoken by a man who otherwise refused language. And yet Maigret felt he was listening to something more than silence. Silence itself had tone, weight, inflection. In silence, a man revealed himself more starkly than in speech. A duel, Maigret thought again, with a man who fought not with pistols or knives, but with absence. A duel that would test not quickness, but endurance. He leaned back, let the smoke from his pipe fill the room, and closed his eyes until the images returned. The damp plaster, the peeling wallpaper, the smear of a hand. In these faint signs he would have to build an entire life. Outside, Paris shifted restlessly in the fog. Somewhere, in some café or street, someone knew the drowned man. Someone had seen him speak, had heard his voice. The city was vast, but Maigret's patience was vaster still. He would wait, watching, listening, until the silence broke. It was Maigret's habit, when faced with a void, to send one of his inspectors outward, as if by scattering them across the map of France he might net some hidden thread. Janvier, young enough to walk briskly yet steady enough to inspire confidence, was chosen this time. His instructions were not elaborate. He was to leave Paris, take the provincial trains, and ask questions in towns where the drowned man's shadow might have brushed the cobblestones. The orders were simple, but the task itself was as murky as the Seine in winter. That morning, as fog still clung low over the city, Janvier stepped onto the platform at Gare de Lyon. The iron vault of the station echoed with the hiss of steam, the calls of porters, the shuffle of travellers carrying valises. Janvier carried only a leather satchel with papers, a notebook, and the pipe Maigret had half-jokingly pressed into his hand. "It helps," the chief had said. "When you sit and wait, people talk more freely when there is smoke." The train lurched forward, its wheels clanging against rails that stretched like dull silver into the distance. Janvier settled by the window, his breath frosting the glass. Fields appeared, flat and grey, dotted with bare trees that looked like black veins against the pale sky. At each station, the rhythm repeated, a few figures on the platform, a dog nosing at luggage, the smell of coffee from the buffet. France in winter was subdued, and the inspector felt the weight of its silence pressing on him with each passing kilometre. His first stop was a small town on the edge of Burgundy, where the café near the station doubled as an inn. Janvier entered, shaking off the cold, and found the place nearly empty, save for a pair of men in work clothes drinking red wine before noon. The walls smelled of damp plaster and old tobacco, a scent he was already beginning to associate with this case. He spread the man's description like a net across the counter. Dark hair, average height, 30s, always alone, eyes calm. The innkeeper frowned, polished a glass with a rag, and finally shook his head. No such man had stayed here. Travellers left impressions, even fleeting ones. This one had left none. Janvier persisted, moving from café to café, from inn to post office, from station master to Market Square. At each place he offered the same description, and at each place he met the same uncertain responses. Perhaps someone thought they had seen a man like that waiting on the platform or sitting by himself at the back of a hall. But memory was a fog as thick as the one over the Seine. No one could say with certainty. By evening, Janvier boarded another train, this one rattling southward through valleys lined with vineyards stripped bare for the season. He thought of Maigret in his office, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling, waiting with the patience of stone. The young inspector felt both proud and burdened by the responsibility. He was hunting shadows on behalf of a man who could smell truth in silence. The second town was livelier, a place where the factories hummed and workers spilled into the streets at dusk. Here, too, Janvier walked from door to door, his notebook growing heavier with names that led nowhere. In a café by the river, where bargemen warmed themselves with brandy, he heard the first rumour worth noting. A bargeman claimed he had seen a stranger weeks ago, a solitary man who boarded a eider vessel for a short stretch, offering coins for passage without conversation. He disembarked at the next town, leaving nothing behind. The bargeman swore he remembered the calmness of his eyes. Janvier's pen scratched quickly across the page. A fleeting thread perhaps, but one that confirmed the drowned man had drifted through these provinces like mist, always alone, always moving, never planting roots. He pressed further, boarding yet another train at dawn, the countryside sliding past in shades of frost and mud. He slept little, his body stiff from narrow seats, his dreams full of faceless men climbing aboard and vanishing before he could ask their names. By the third town, exhaustion pressed on him, but the work demanded endurance. He questioned station clerks, concierges, priests, and café owners. Each encounter was marked by polite shrugs, vague recollections, or silence. One evening, in a village where the train stopped only twice a day, Janvier found himself in a cramped tavern lit by a single oil lamp. The patrons eyed him warily, for strangers rarely came except to pass through. When he described the drowned man, the room fell momentarily quiet. At last, an old woman spoke, her voice trembling. Yes, she thought she had seen him. A month earlier, perhaps 2. He had walked the main street at dusk, coat collar turned up, eyes lowered. She remembered because he had stopped outside her shop window, staring at nothing in particular, as if listening for something only he could hear. Then he walked on, disappearing into the fog. Janvier noted it carefully, thanked her, and left with the unease that always followed such testimony. The man had been here, perhaps, or perhaps memory had embroidered a ghost to match the inspector's description. Yet even uncertainty was a kind of progress. The days blurred into one another, each train ride merging with the next. At every station, Janvier lit his pipe, inhaling the smoke as though it could fill the emptiness of his search. He thought of Maigret, not impatient, but inexorable, awaiting each telegram he dispatched. The messages were brief, no papers, no luggage, possibly seen on barge. Woman claims sighting in village, always signed Janvier. And Maigret, he imagined, would sit at his desk, reading those spare lines with the same heavy calm he applied to everything. He would not be surprised by the lack of answers. For Maigret, absence was itself a form of reply. On the final leg of his errand, Janvier travelled to a provincial capital, larger than the others, with boulevards broad enough to swallow the mist. Here, in the echoing station hall, he paused longer than usual. The crowd bustled, voices overlapping, the smell of coffee stronger. It struck him that if the drowned man had passed here, he might have been no different from any other traveller, a man with a coat, a ticket, a silence that blended into the murmur of the crowd. He spent 2 days questioning clerks, innkeepers, and waiters. Some thought they might have seen him, but no one could say when or where or why. In the end, Janvier returned to the station with his satchel no heavier than when he had left Paris. His notebook, though filled with words, contained no certainty. Only rumours, fragments, impressions. On the train back to the city, the inspector stared out at the countryside rolling past, his reflection superimposed on the glass like a double exposure. He felt the futility of the chase, but also a strange respect. The drowned man had lived with a discipline of invisibility that was almost artful. To leave no paper, no luggage, no memory, strong enough to hold him, that was not accident, but will. When at last he stepped back into the fog of Paris, Janvier felt as though he had been walking through a dream. He carried his notes to Maigret's office, where the chief sat as always, pipe smoke thickening the air. Maigret read each page slowly, his eyes narrowing, not with disappointment, but with a faint glimmer of recognition. The silence of the provinces matched the silence of the room, the cafes, the river. It was a pattern, and Maigret, more than anyone, understood patterns in silence. "Good," he said simply, returning the notebook. "Now we know how deep the fog goes." Janvier sat weary, the clatter of trains still ringing in his ears. Outside, the Seine flowed unseen beneath the mist, carrying its secrets past the bridges. Somewhere within that fog, the duel continued. Paris changes its face at night, and nowhere is the transformation more striking than in Montmartre. The daylight reveals its crooked streets, the stairways climbing toward the basilica, the houses patched together like mismatched stones. But once darkness falls and the lamps flicker alive, Montmartre becomes something else entirely, a theatre of smoke and laughter, of cheap music drifting from cellar doors, of women with painted faces leaning in doorways, and men with restless eyes carrying their troubles up and down the steep lanes. It was into this theatre that Maigret now turned his steps, for a whisper had reached him that the drowned man had been seen here, in company he might not have chosen willingly. The whisper came from a woman who had stopped by the Quai des Orfèvres one morning, her shawl frayed, her voice thick with brandy from the night before. She claimed she had seen the man weeks earlier in a bar off the Boulevard de Clichy, accompanied by another figure she could not name. Her testimony was uncertain, half shrouded in the confusion of drink, but something in her manner convinced Maigret not to dismiss it. Even unreliable witnesses could carry truth in their uncertainty. He climbed the hill in the evening, pipe clenched between his teeth, breath forming pale clouds in the cold. Montmartre smelled of roasting chestnuts, of cheap perfume, of wine poured too quickly. Music from an accordion spilled out of a doorway, blending with laughter that held more fatigue than joy. The stud inspector moved slowly, his heavy coat brushing against passers-by, his eyes calm and searching. He had always trusted Montmartre to speak eventually, though it never spoke directly. The bar in question was a narrow cellar lit by gas lamps that smoked and hissed. A staircase led downward into the fog of bodies pressed close, the air dense with cigarette smoke and spilled drink. Women sat at the tables, their laughter sharp, their glances quick, while men argued over cards or leaned into corners to whisper deals that would not withstand daylight. The barman glanced at Maigret with a flicker of recognition. A heavy man in a bowler hat, pipe clenched firmly, was not easily mistaken for a casual patron. Still, Maigret ordered a glass of red and stood a moment by the bar, letting his presence settle like a stone dropped into water. It took time. Patrons eyed him warily at first, but soon returned to their games and quarrels. Only when the air had relaxed again did Maigret lean slightly toward the barman. "A man," he said simply, describing the drowned one in the same spare words he had used in cafes along the Seine. Dark hair, 30s, silent, calm eyes, always alone. The barman frowned, shook his head, then paused. Yes, perhaps such a man had been there. Not often, once or twice. He came with another taller, older, but never stayed long. "Did they speak?" Maigret asked. The barman shrugged. "Perhaps." But softly, so softly that no one else heard. He could not say if they were friends or enemies or strangers sharing silence. In Montmartre, silence itself was a kind of currency. Maigret sipped the wine, though it was thin and sour, and let the room blur around him. He watched the faces, the gestures, the way laughter stopped abruptly when money changed hands. Somewhere in this room, perhaps, lingered someone who had noticed more. He waited, pipe smoke curling lazily from his lips, until at last a woman in a green dress drifted near. Her perfume was sweet, almost cloying, and her eyes darted with curiosity. She leaned close, her voice a whisper meant only for him. "I saw him," she said, "not once, twice, always with the same one. A tall man with a scar by his ear. They sat there." She pointed toward a table near the wall where shadows pooled. "Never more than an hour, then gone." Maigret turned his head slightly. "Do you know the tall one?" The woman shook her head, her earrings catching the lamplight. "No name, but he doesn't belong here. He walks as if he's waiting for someone to call his bluff." She laughed softly, then moved away, swallowed by the crowd. The inspector remained seated, turning her words over like coins in his pocket. A scar by the ear, a tall man, a companion to the drowned one. It was the first real shape to emerge from the fog, faint but distinct. He rose, left coins on the counter, and stepped back into the cold night. Montmartre's streets twisted like veins, climbing steeply, lined with shuttered shops and cafes that never truly closed. Maigret walked slowly, pipe glowing faintly, his breath mingling with the mist. He imagined the two men, one calm, anonymous, erased, the other taller, marked by a scar. They had sat together in that cellar, whispering in voices no one could hear. What had bound them? Fear? Business? Betrayal? In Paris, alliances were as temporary as fog, dissolving with the dawn. He followed the whisper further, night after night, returning to Montmartre, as if the hill itself held answers. He questioned women whose eyes flickered with both calculation and kindness, bartenders who remembered nothing until their palms were warmed by coins, musicians who swore they had seen everything though they noticed little. Again and again the same faint echo returned. Two men, seated together, silent, then gone. One evening on the Rue Lepic, a cabaret singer with a tired smile told him more. She had seen the pair outside after midnight, standing under a gas lamp. The taller man had spoken sharply, his hand on the other's arm, while the drowned one merely listened, his face calm, his posture resigned. The singer had hurried past, unwilling to draw attention, but the image had remained with her. The strange intimacy of two men bound by words unheard. Maigret walked home that night with the picture vivid in his mind. He could almost see them beneath the lamp, shadows against the fog, one voice raised, the other silent. A quarrel, perhaps, or a command, or something darker. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the inspector laid his notes across the desk, pipe smoke thickening the room. For the first time, the drowned man was not entirely alone. He had been seen in company. He had listened to another man. He had been bound, however briefly, to a thread of life that might lead back to a name. Yet even this thread was tenuous, woven of whispers, glimpsed in smoky bars, half remembered by women who saw too much. Still it was something. In a duel fought against silence, even the faintest echo mattered. Maigret leaned back, eyes half closed, the city murmuring beyond the window. Montmartre was a stage, and on its stage the drowned man had played a role, brief, enigmatic, unfinished. Now the inspector would have to find the scarred man, the one who had shared his silence. For in that silence lay the next step, and perhaps the first true crack in the fog. Paris is a city of faces, yet it is also a city of shadows. In the crowded streets, the cafes with their smoke and laughter, the markets ringing with the cries of vendors, there are always those who pass unseen, their presence felt only by the faint disturbance they leave behind. It was such a figure that now drew Maigret's attention, the man with the scar glimpsed in Montmartre, half remembered by women with tired eyes, described in fragments of testimony that blurred like smoke. A tall man, marked by a scar near his ear, always beside the drowned one, always silent when others watched. The inspector began to follow his ghost across Paris, piecing together traces that were less than evidence, more than rumour. He was said to have been seen in a café by the canal, always near the door, never staying longer than a single drink. Another claimed to have noticed him outside a tobacconist's, the scar catching the light of a street lamp. A waiter recalled a tall silhouette leaving coins on a table, never waiting for change. The man was everywhere and nowhere, moving through the city like a shadow, cast by a lamp one could not locate. For days Maigret haunted the cafes himself, his heavy form hunched in corners, pipe smoke wreathing his head. He watched the doors, the mirrors, the faces reflected in stained glass. At times he felt certain he would see the scarred man step in, tall and calm, yet each time it was only another worker, another idler, another stranger with tired eyes. Still the inspector's patience was inexhaustible. He could wait longer than fog, longer than silence. One evening, on the Quai de Gemapes, Maigret thought he caught sight of him at last. A tall figure stood by the railing, coat collar turned up, the mist from the canal rising around him. The scar was not visible in the dim light, yet something in the way he held himself, still listening, suggested the same calm presence described by others. Maigret walked slowly toward him, pipe unlit in his hand, footsteps echoing softly against the wet stones. But when he reached the spot, the man was gone, swallowed by alleys that led into the labyrinth of the 10th arrondissement. The inspector stood a while, staring at the rippling black water before turning back. The newspapers had begun to take notice of the case. They wrote of the man without a past, of the drowned body with no name, of the mysterious inspector who smoked his pipe while chasing shadows. Some embellished, inventing lovers, debts, political intrigues. Others mocked the police for following whispers in bars. Maigret read them in silence, then folded the papers neatly and placed them aside. The duel was not with the press, though their chatter added weight to his steps. It was with the scarred man, or rather, with the absence he represented. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Lucas and Janvier brought him scraps of news each morning. Someone thought the scarred man had boarded a tram near Belleville. Another swore he had seen him buying matches in the Marais. Always vague, always unverifiable. Yet together they formed a pattern, like stars scattered in a cloudy sky, suggesting a presence that moved constantly, never rooted. Maigret tapped the reports with his thick fingers, pipe smoke curling from his lips. "He's careful," he murmured. "Too careful. A man who erases himself as he walks." The inspector began to think of him not as a person, but as an atmosphere, a pressure in the air. One did not see him so much as sense him, as one senses a draught when a door is opened somewhere, unseen. He imagined the scar glinting briefly under a lamp, a reminder that even shadows carry marks. That scar was his only anchor, the single imperfection that betrayed existence. One night, following a lead into the quartier of Les Halles, Maigret entered a café crowded with porters and stall workers. The smell of onions, sweat, and damp coats was overwhelming. He ordered a glass, sat heavily, and listened. A man beside him muttered of a tall figure who sometimes came in after midnight, drank quickly, and left before conversation began. The scar, yes, near the ear. He never gambled, never joked, never looked at women. Always alone, except once when he had been seen with another man, the drowned one. Maigret's pipe smoke thickened the air as he absorbed the words. It was confirmation, faint yet undeniable. The two men had been together, tied by something invisible, the drowned one erased, the scarred one drifting like fog. It was less a partnership than a shadow leaning on a shadow. The inspector left the café and walked slowly back through the market, where stalls were closing, the air pungent with fish and cabbage. He felt the city pressing in on him, full of faces yet strangely faceless. The duel had sharpened. He was no longer seeking a body, but a man who existed precisely by avoiding existence. At home, Madame Maigret placed a plate before him, her eyes searching his heavy face. He ate in silence, pipe at his elbow, thoughts elsewhere. She did not press him. She never did. She knew the fog of his cases would only lift when it chose, not when she asked. Days turned into a week. The scarred man continued to elude him, leaving only sightings that evaporated under scrutiny. Yet Maigret felt him closer than ever, as if the city itself were preparing to deliver him, reluctantly, into the inspector's path. He began to frequent Montmartre again, slipping into the cellar bars where shadows clung to corners. He watched, waited, drank little, smoked steadily. And one night, near the Rue des Martyrs, he saw him. The tall figure entered quietly, almost unnoticed, but Maigret's eyes fixed on him instantly. The scar caught the lamplight for an instant, a pale line near the ear. The man ordered a drink, stood by the wall, and scanned the room with eyes that seemed to see nothing and everything. Maigret remained still, pipe smoke rising in lazy rings. He did not approach, not yet. To startle such a figure was to lose him forever. The scarred man drank, left coins, and departed as quietly as he had entered. Maigret rose only after a moment, heavy and unhurried, following into the night. The streets twisted, fog rising from the gutters, lamps glowing faintly. The inspector kept his distance, his steps muffled. The man walked steadily, turning once into a narrow passage, then vanishing. When Maigret reached the corner, there was only emptiness. Yet the inspector did not curse, did not despair. He stood beneath the lamp, pipe glowing faintly, and knew the duel had entered its truest phase. The man in the shadows was real, no longer rumour. He moved through Paris with the discipline of a ghost, but ghosts, too, left trails. Back at the quay, Maigret leaned over the map of the city, marking places where the scarred one had been glimpsed: Montmartre, Les Halles, the canals, the riverbanks. A pattern began to emerge, faint but insistent, like lines drawn by an invisible hand. The man was not wandering aimlessly. He was circling, orbiting something, or someone. Maigret lit his pipe again, smoke wreathing his head like fog. The drowned man had been without a past, erased. The scarred man was his only trace, his only connection to life. If Maigret could hold that shadow still, even for a moment, the silence might break. And so he waited, heavy, patient, inexorable, as Paris whispered and shifted in the fog. Somewhere the man in the shadows watched too, and the duel between them deepened. The newspapers had always hovered around the Quai des Orfèvres, like gulls circling a fishing boat, swooping down when there was blood in the water. With this case, however, their presence became something more insistent, a kind of parasitic fog that clung to the investigation no less stubbornly than the mists of the Seine. The drowned man with no past had become their invention, their blank page on which to sketch headlines. By the time the week had passed, Paris no longer spoke of a body pulled from the river, but of l'homme sans passé, the man without a past. It was a phrase that thrilled the public and irritated Maigret, because once the press named something, the truth risked being buried beneath the noise. Each morning the papers arrived on his desk in stacks, ink still damp, smelling faintly of machinery and cold. One announced that the drowned man was the illegitimate son of a banker, erased from family memory after a scandal. Another insisted he had been a spy, moving invisibly between cafes until betrayed by his own shadow. A third painted him as a lover abandoned, driven into the Seine by despair. They quoted unnamed sources, embellished gestures, filled silence with florid prose. The photographs were no better, grainy images of the river, of the quay, of the inspector himself, leaving a cafe with his coat collar raised. The case had become a spectacle, and Maigret, with his heavy frame and pipe, its unwilling protagonist. He sat at his desk, reading in silence, while Lucas shifted impatiently nearby. "They invent more than we discover," Lucas muttered, tossing a paper aside. "The city will believe anything if it's printed." Maigret tamped his pipe slowly, methodically, the way he always did when irritation threatened to surface. "The city believes what it wants," he said, smoke curling from his lips. "It always has. Our task is not to believe with it." Yet he knew the effect could not be ignored. Witnesses arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres, not because they had seen something, but because they had read something. One woman insisted she had known the drowned man intimately, though her description fit nothing. A student swore he had overheard confessions in a cafe that proved the man was a revolutionary. Each testimony, when pressed, dissolved into smoke. It was not memory they brought, but rumour reshaped by the press. Still Maigret listened. He always listened. Even lies carried the imprint of truth somewhere in their folds. He leaned back in his chair, pipe smoke veiling his heavy face, and let each voice pour its story into the silence. Some he dismissed, others he filed away. It was patience, again, the only weapon in a duel where the adversary fought with shadows. The press itself grew bold. One afternoon, a young journalist cornered him outside the quay, notebook ready, eyes sharp with ambition. "Inspector, is it true the drowned man was linked to an underground network, that his companion, the scarred man, has already fled Paris?" Maigret regarded him with the same calm he used for suspects. "What scarred man?" he asked, though his pipe smoke betrayed nothing. The journalist faltered, realizing too late he had revealed more than he possessed. He stammered, scribbled something anyway, and hurried off, coat flapping in the wind. Maigret stood a moment longer on the steps, staring at the grey river through the mist. The rumour had spread beyond Montmartre now, into print, into the bloodstream of the city. Soon every café would hum with the story of the scarred man, whether he existed or not. The duel had widened, the adversary multiplied into imagination itself. At night, the inspector walked home through the narrow streets, his heavy steps echoing off damp stones. He passed kiosks where papers were displayed, the headlines shouting like hawkers. He thought of Madame Maigret waiting with her quiet smile, the table laid neatly, the stew kept warm. The contrast between the order of his home and the chaos of the press struck him sharply. At home, silence meant comfort. Here, in the streets, silence was devoured by rumour until nothing remained. One evening, a colleague from the Sûreté confided over a glass that the ministry itself was unsettled. The case had grown too visible. Questions were asked in higher offices. Why had the police not solved the mystery of the man without a past? Why was the press leading the investigation more than the inspectors? Maigret listened without surprise, nodding heavily. He had weathered such storms before. He knew that power disliked mysteries when the newspapers made them spectacles. Yet he also knew that forcing answers too quickly only deepened the shadows. The following morning he returned to Montmartre, pipe clenched, hat low, entering cafés where smoke and rumour thickened the air. He heard his own name whispered in corners, distorted by gossip. Some said Maigret had already found the scarred man and was hiding him for reasons of state. Others claimed the inspector dined secretly with bankers whose families feared exposure. Each story was absurd, yet each grew legs, walking from one bar to another, gaining weight with every retelling. In one cellar bar, a man drunk on cheap brandy rose and pointed at him. "You already know who he is," the man shouted. "You just won't say, because the truth would bring down the city." Laughter followed, some nervous, some mocking. Maigret stood motionless, pipe glowing faintly, until the noise subsided. Then he turned and left, his heavy coat brushing the doorframe. Outside, the fog pressed closer, and he felt again the duel tightening. He was no longer chasing only a scarred man, but the city's own fevered imagination. Back at the quay, he spread the papers across his desk, weighing them with his thick hands. Each headline was a blow, each column a distortion. Yet beneath it all, he sensed the outline of something real. The drowned man had chosen silence, erasure, absence. The scarred man moved like a shadow, avoiding eyes, but the press, by accident, was painting the same portrait, of men who resisted being known, who slipped between categories, who unsettled by their refusal to belong. Maigret leaned back, smoke wreathing his head, and considered. Perhaps the duel was not only with individuals, but with the age itself. An age of noise, of rumour, of headlines louder than truth. To fight it, he would need more patience than ever, more silence, more watching. He would need to let the storm exhaust itself until the truth stood quietly in its shadow. That night he walked once more along the Seine, the lamps blurred in the mist, the water black and indifferent. A newspaper boy passed, shouting the latest edition, waving sheets still warm from the press. Maigret bought one, folded it neatly, and tucked it under his arm. Then he stood at the railing, pipe glowing faintly, and stared into the river that had delivered him, the man without a past. The duel continued, now fought on two fronts, against the scarred man in the shadows, and against the rumours in print. And Maigret, heavy and patient, prepared himself to endure both. The city, with all its noise and rumour, had begun to suffocate the case. In the press, the drowned man was already a legend, reshaped daily, according to the appetite of readers. But Maigret knew that truth often lay not in headlines or cellar whispers, but in the quiet persistence of memory. And memory, when not clouded by wine or gossip, often lived far from Paris, in the provinces where scandal lingered longer than smoke. It was late afternoon when Maigret decided to follow that thread himself. He boarded a train at Gare d'Austerlitz, the air inside the carriage heavy with the smell of damp coats and coal. Outside the window the city thinned, replaced by flat fields glistening with frost. Villages passed like fleeting shadows, church spires, squares with shuttered shops, taverns where a single lamp glowed against the dusk. Maigret leaned back in his seat, pipe unlit, his heavy face half-veiled by the reflection of the lamp above him. He was not expecting revelation. He sought only the faintest trace, the echo of a name that Paris had erased. The first town was small, its station a modest shelter of timber, where the station-master greeted him with the bored courtesy reserved for inspectors from the capital. Maigret described the drowned man once more. Dark hair, 30s, solitary, calm eyes. The station-master frowned, tugged his moustache, then shrugged. So many passed through, silent travellers who left no name. But he did recall something, though uncertain. A stranger who had taken the early train weeks ago, paying in coins, speaking little. Could it have been the same man? Perhaps. Perhaps not. The uncertainty was its own form of silence. In the tavern near the square, Maigret questioned the locals. Men hunched over glasses of red wine studied him with suspicion, reluctant to speak to a Parisian inspector. Yet one old man, after much hesitation, muttered that there had once been talk years ago of a family scandal in a nearby village. A son disowned, his name struck from memory, his presence denied even when spoken of. The details were vague, distorted by time, but Maigret's ears pricked. A disowned son, a man erased. Was this not another way of describing the drowned one? He pressed further, travelling by local trains that seemed to crawl across the countryside. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth. At each village he repeated the same description, received the same shrugs, the same hesitant fragments. Yet with each fragment a pattern began to form, like faint lines emerging beneath water. He heard of a family that had once been prominent, whose name carried weight in town councils and provincial salons, but whose eldest son had disappeared from conversation. The family no longer spoke of him. The neighbours, out of respect or fear, followed suit. It was as if he had never existed, as if silence itself had been cultivated to blot him out. One evening Maigret sat in a small inn, the fire weak in the hearth, a bowl of soup cooling before him. The innkeeper's wife, wiping her hands on her apron, lowered her voice when she spoke. Yes, she remembered whispers from her youth. A boy who had gone to Paris, who had been disowned after some disgrace no one dared name. She had never seen him again, though rumours had floated back, sightings in the city, always fleeting, always uncertain. She shivered as she recalled how the family had forbidden even the mention of his name. They wanted him to vanish, she murmured, as if he had never been born. Maigret stirred his soup, though he barely ate. The words clung to him, to vanish as if never born. That was the essence of the drowned man. a life lived in erasure, a discipline of silence, a careful avoidance of trace. Perhaps it had not been choice alone. Perhaps it had begun here, in provincial parlours, with the closing of doors and the sealing of lips. The inspector did not press too hard. He knew the stubbornness of provincial pride. Families buried their secrets deeper than graves, and to dig too violently was to find only hostility. Instead he listened, nodded, let the words flow in their own rhythm. Each night he wrote sparse notes in his book. Family erased son, silence cultivated, rumours of Paris, disowned for scandal, reason unknown. The words themselves were as empty as the drowned man's room. Yet together they formed a portrait of absence, more eloquent than presence. When he returned to Paris, the fog greeted him like an accomplice. The Seine flowed dark, barges moving slowly, whistles low and mournful. Maigret carried the provincial silence back to the Quai des Orfèvres, where Lucas and Janvier waited. He spread his notes across the desk, pipe smoke curling above them. The others frowned. There were no names, no concrete links, only whispers. Yet Maigret felt the weight of it. He knew the taste of truth when it lay beneath silence. Perhaps the drowned man had been that disowned son. Perhaps he had chosen anonymity because it was forced upon him. Perhaps the scarred man was connected to that buried past. The inspector did not claim certainty. He never did. But he felt the duel shifting once more. It was no longer only between him and the shadow in the cafes. It stretched backward into time, into families who erased their own, into the provinces where silence grew like ivy over old walls. That night, walking home along the quays, Maigret paused to light his pipe beneath a lamp. The flame flared briefly, then died, leaving only the faint glow of tobacco. He thought of the provincial villages, the women who lowered their voices, the men who shrugged. He thought of the drowned man, alone in his room, erasing himself as carefully as one crosses out a line of ink. And he thought of the scarred man, still at large in the city, orbiting the silence like a restless planet. The Seine whispered below, indifferent, carrying away secrets toward the sea. Yet Maigret knew some secrets did not dissolve. They lingered, heavy, patient, waiting for the one who could bear their weight. He exhaled smoke, slow and steady, and resolved to wait as long as it took. The provincial thread was thin, but it was thread nonetheless, and in a duel against absence, even the faintest thread could become a rope. In the end, the case boiled down to silence, the silence of the drowned man, the silence of the scarred man, and the silence of the city that wrapped itself in fog as thick as the secrets it kept. Paris, as always, was a city full of noise, yet in the midst of it, Maigret found that the most insistent truths were those that whispered, not shouted. In the quiet corners of cafes, in the muted exchanges between strangers, in the way the light flickered against the wet stones of the quay, the truth lingered like a shadow, just beyond reach. Maigret had come to understand something in the weeks of following this case. It was not the body in the river that mattered most. It was the absence of it, the void left behind, the ghost of a man who had chosen to be forgotten long before he had died. A man who had no name, no history, nothing but the echo of his disappearance. He had left nothing to trace, no papers, no letters, no photographs. Even his death was swallowed by the water without ceremony. Yet Maigret, with his patient eyes and his understanding of silence, knew that something deeper was at play. There was more to this case than the drowning. There was something deliberate, something planned. The city had gone on without him, just as it always did. The newspapers had already found another story to chew on, another headline to chase. The scarred man, however, remained a shadow. Maigret could almost feel him now, lurking at the edge of his thoughts, his presence faint but undeniable. He had been the one who had brought the drowned man to Paris, who had been his companion through the cafes, through the streets, and who had vanished once the police began to draw too near. But the scarred man, like the drowned man, was not a person so much as a presence, an absence that could not be ignored. And so Maigret followed, with the same quiet patience that had served him through countless other cases. He would not chase shadows or ghosts. He would wait for them to reveal themselves in the same way one waits for fog to lift. One evening, while walking home along the riverbank, Maigret found himself drawn back to the scene of the drowning. The fog had not yet lifted, and the river moved sluggishly, its dark surface interrupted only by the occasional ripple from a passing boat. He stood for a moment at the water's edge, staring out into the mist, his hands in his pockets, the familiar scent of the Seine filling his lungs. The case had become more than just an investigation. It had become an obsession, a quiet duel fought not with weapons or words, but with patience and instinct. It was then that he saw him, the scarred man. Not standing on the quay, not in a doorway, but walking along the water's edge, moving as quietly as a shadow. He was taller than Maigret had imagined, but his gait was slow and deliberate, as if he knew he was being watched. Maigret's pulse quickened, though he did not move. He stood motionless, his back against the cold stone of the embankment, waiting. The scarred man walked past without noticing him, his head slightly tilted, as if listening to the sound of the water, or perhaps to the silence that stretched between them. For a moment, Maigret felt as though the city itself had ceased to breathe, that everything had come to a standstill except for the man with the scar. The figure was almost otherworldly, his silhouette merging with the mist, a part of the night itself. Maigret remained still, watching. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moments were often those when nothing happened, when time stretched and each second seemed to carry more weight than it should. The scarred man was waiting for something, perhaps to be noticed, perhaps for the right moment, to vanish again into the fog. But Maigret was not fooled by the stillness. He could see it in the man's posture, in the way he held himself, the tension of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. The minutes passed. Maigret did not move. The scarred man stopped at the edge of the quay, his back turned to the river, and stood motionless, as if he had forgotten time itself. For a long while, Maigret thought he might turn around, might step into the fog and disappear as he had before. But instead he remained there, as though he too were caught in the waiting silence of the city. It was then that Maigret made his move. Quietly, carefully, he approached from behind, keeping his steps muffled by the thick fog. He was close enough now to hear the faint rustle of the man's coat against the cold night air. The scarred man had not noticed him. He had never heard Maigret's approach, never sensed the inspector's presence. He was, like so many others in the city, unaware of the eyes that followed him from the shadows. When Maigret finally spoke, it was not with the abruptness of confrontation, but with the quiet certainty of a man who had already won the duel. "You know, there's no need to keep hiding." The scarred man stiffened, his shoulders tense with recognition. He did not turn, but for a moment, Maigret saw his fingers tighten around the railing. The man's voice, when it came, was low, rough, an echo of years spent moving unseen through the city. "You've been following me?" Maigret did not answer immediately. He lit his pipe slowly, drawing in the smoke as the man's presence filled the air between them. The scarred man shifted, his back still to the inspector. "You've been following the wrong person," he said at last. The drowned man is long gone. You're wasting your time." Maigret took another slow drag from his pipe, letting the smoke curl up into the fog. "No, I'm not wasting my time. You are." He took a step closer, his voice calm, even. "You're hiding because you're scared. Not of me, of what you've done." For the first time, the scarred man turned. He did not face Maigret directly, but his eyes flickered in the faint light, glinting with something, defiance, perhaps, or regret. "It's too late," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the sound of the river. "Nothing can undo it now." Maigret watched him carefully, his eyes narrowed. "You didn't want to be found, but here you are, standing in front of me." He took a final drag from his pipe and tossed it into the river, the embers sizzling against the dark water. "The past doesn't disappear just because we wish it would, and neither do you." The scarred man remained still, his eyes hard, his mouth set in a grim line. "You don't understand?" he said, almost to himself. "You can't understand." Maigret stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He looked at the man, really looked at him, and saw more than just a criminal. He saw someone who had been living in the same silence as the drowned man, someone who had erased himself from the world just as thoroughly. The inspector did not need words to see the regret in the scarred man's eyes. "Maybe I don't understand," Maigret said quietly. "But I know what it's like to live with silence." For a long moment, the two men stood there, facing each other across the gap of their shared silence. Neither spoke. And yet, in that stillness, the duel was won, not by force, but by recognition. The scarred man had lived in the shadow of the drowned man, moving through the city as a ghost, just as Maigret had suspected. He had hoped to remain invisible, to fade into the mist, like the man who had come before him. But in the end, they were both marked by their choices, by their refusal to live in the light. Finally, Maigret turned and began to walk away, the fog swallowing him as it had swallowed so many others. Behind him, the scarred man remained, standing at the edge of the quay, staring out at the river, his past and his future both uncertain. And for Maigret, the case was closed, not with triumph, but with a quiet understanding that even the most silent of duels must eventually come to an end. The fog had not lifted by the time Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres the next morning. It clung to the city like a shroud, as though the streets themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable to unfold. Paris seemed suspended in time, each moment stretching into the next with a weight that could almost be felt. And in that silence, the echoes of the case, the drowned man, the scarred man, the endless whispers, hung heavy, just out of reach, like smoke curling into the sky. Maigret had solved the mystery, or at least he had uncovered its truth. Yet even now, standing at his desk, looking over the same papers, the same notes that had accumulated over weeks, he could not shake the feeling that the case had not truly ended. There was still something left unsaid, some trace yet to be discovered. The city, after all, had a way of keeping its secrets, of swallowing the past as easily as it swallowed the fog. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the stillness of the office. Maigret's hand, which had been resting on a letter he had yet to open, moved slowly to the receiver. He listened as Lucas's voice came over the line, urgent, almost surprised. "We've found something, Inspector." For a moment, Maigret felt his pulse quicken, though he knew it could be nothing new. Another false lead, another piece of the puzzle that would slip through his fingers. But even in that moment of resignation, he could not help but feel the pull of it. The inevitable tug that every case seemed to have, no matter how resolved it appeared. "What is it?" he asked, his voice steady but taut with curiosity. "It's about the drowned man's family," Lucas said. "We've found a connection, a name. And we've got someone who says they know who he really was." Maigret's hand tightened on the receiver, and he felt a flicker of something, an old instinct, an old pull that always seemed to surface at the most unexpected moments. The case had taken so many twists, so many turns, and yet it had always come back to the same central truth: a man with no past. But now, for the first time, that past was beginning to take shape. "Where is it?" Maigret asked, already reaching for his coat, already knowing that the fog would not lift until this final thread was pulled free. By the time Maigret arrived at the address Lucas had provided, the city had begun to shift beneath the weight of its secrets. The rain had started to fall, a thin, persistent drizzle that seemed to soak into everything, turning the streets slick and dark. The building was old, its facade cracked with age, a forgotten corner of Paris that had long since surrendered to the passage of time. Inside, the air smelled of dust and faded memories, the kind of place where nothing new ever seemed to grow. Lucas was waiting for him by the door, his face set in a frown of uncertainty. He nodded briefly as Maigret approached, then led him inside. "The man who contacted us," Lucas explained, "claims to have known the drowned man. He says he was part of his family, and he's willing to speak to you. But there's something off about it, Inspector." The man's nervous, scared. "I don't trust him." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly. He had learned long ago to trust his own instincts over anyone else's, especially when the scent of fear was thick in the air. Fear, after all, was often the first clue. They made their way down a narrow hallway, the walls peeling, the floorboards creaking beneath their feet. At the end of the hall was a door, its paint chipped, the hinges rusty from years of disuse. Lucas knocked, and the door opened slowly, revealing a man who was little more than a silhouette in the dim light. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, his clothes worn and ill-fitting. He stepped aside without a word, gesturing for them to enter. Inside, the room was small, sparsely furnished, with only a single chair and a table that seemed to sag under the weight of time. The man's gaze flickered nervously from Maigret to Lucas, his hands twitching at his sides. "I'm afraid I don't have much to offer," the man said in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "But I know who he was. I knew him. I swear it." Maigret studied him carefully, taking in every detail, the way the man's breath caught in his throat, the way his fingers twitched. There was fear here, yes, but also something else, something deeper, something hidden. Maigret sat down across from the man, his eyes never leaving him. "Who was he?" Maigret asked, his voice calm, but carrying the weight of a question that had been lingering for weeks. The man swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as though looking for a way out. "He was my brother," he said finally, his voice shaking. "He disappeared years ago after something happened. We didn't know where he went. No one did." Maigret leaned forward slightly. "And what happened?" The man's hands trembled. "There was an accident, a scandal, something that the family wanted to forget, to bury. He was involved and they—" He stopped abruptly, his voice faltering. He glanced at Lucas, then back at Maigret. "I don't know if he's the same man, Inspector, but I think he is. I think he's the one who drowned." Maigret sat still, absorbing the words. The family, the scandal, the disappearance. It was all beginning to make sense, piece by piece. But the man's fear was palpable, and Maigret could see that there was more here than he was willing to admit. "You're afraid," Maigret said softly. The man's gaze snapped up to meet his. "Yes, I'm afraid." Or what? The man hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously toward the door. Of what he became, of what he was mixed up in. He swallowed again, his face pale. You don't know what he was, Inspector. You don't know the things he did before he disappeared. He wasn't just a lost son. He was someone else entirely. Maigret felt a shiver of something dark, something deeper than the surface of this case. Tell me, he said, his voice low, compelling. The man's lips parted, but no words came. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, as though some invisible weight had been lifted, the man spoke. He wasn't just a son, he whispered. He was the one who had to take the blame. But before he could continue, the door behind them slammed open, and the room seemed to darken all at once. Another figure stepped inside, tall and silent, his face hidden in shadow. I think that's enough, the man said in a low, cold voice. Maigret stood, his gaze fixed on the new arrival. The scarred man had arrived at last, not in a cafe or alley, but here, in the quiet of the room where the past could no longer be hidden. The duel, Maigret realized, was over, but the final trace, like the fog itself, would never completely disappear.